It is Friday, August 11th. Let's talk PlayStation. Welcome back, everyone, to another scrumptious episode of LTPS. As always, let's begin with our PlayStation Plus reminder. If you have not just yet, make sure you claim the August PS Plus Essential Games. They're live on PSN. But this coming Tuesday, on the 15th, we have the lineup for PS Plus Extra and Premium, which there's something very peculiar going on with this lineup. We have almost three games launching day one into PS Plus Extra. So this coming Tuesday, Moving Out 2 comes out, and that will be playable on PS Plus Extra. But later in the month, there's also Lawn Mowing Simulator Landmark Edition on the 28th, and then on the 29th is Sea of Stars. That's the turn-based classic RPG, so that'll be playable on day one as well. Now, I say almost three because Lawn Mowing Simulator is kind of a technicality. The base game is already on PS Plus Extra. It's just the Landmark Edition is a separate SKU that has 2 additional content packs. And plus, I think that game is already available at retail, I'm pretty sure. So, we have almost 3 games launching day one into PS Plus, which is certainly a new thing for the company. They've been a lot more forthcoming in arranging deals for day one launches, and so while we're still not expecting AAA stuff, it does seem quite welcomed that they are doing a lot more day one titles on PlayStation Plus Extra. Now, elsewhere on the list, we have Dreams, so if you don't claim it for the Essential tier this month, then it's probably going to sit on Extra indefinitely, which is good. Let that game always have some access. Also, Destiny 2, The Witch Queen, Lost Judgment, Destroy All Humans 2 Reprobed, Curse to Golf, which is really cool because I was just about to buy that game. But yeah, it's a solid month. And then for PS Plus Premium, we have 3 PSP titles: Medieval Resurrection, Ape Escape on the Loose, and Pursuit Force Extreme Justice. So it seems more and more obvious that Sony probably is having a little bit of an issue here trying to get any kind of third-party publishers on board with bringing back their old IP and releasing them under this Classics program. It's been primarily Sony properties, which is not a bad thing. I mean, I want Sony to bring back all their old games and make them playable on PS4, PS5, but when it's, primarily them leaning off their own catalog, I mean, big surprise that they're only rationing these titles out to 2-3 a month or so. And while that probably was always going to be the case, considering there's not a huge price delta between Extra and Premium, but still, it seems like it's been a lot of Sony IP, and they're not really getting many third-party games on this service. So I don't know what the approach is here when they're, talking to third parties and they're saying, here's our terms, because obviously they want to price these games in a range of $6 to $10. It's also part of Premium via subscription. They do try to encourage grandfathering, so if somebody bought the game on PS3's PlayStation Store, then users get to re-download the game for free. More and more publishers are keeping these IP close to their chest for their own interest of re-releasing and doing a native port, maybe really sprucing the game up and pricing it a lot higher than what they would get from Sony from the Classics program. So I don't know, I'm just kind of rambling, but it seems obvious at this point, a year on, that it's been it's been primarily Sony IP, and that's probably why. So for the time being, we're going to have to just keep expecting 3-4 games every month, and they're likely going to be Sony IP. So I still don't find that to be an issue. There is something to be said about how there's still no new PS2 emulator, which means no new PS2 games, and that now we're seeing crossover with things like Ape Escape on the Loose, and we already have the PS1 Ape Escape, which I find is not a big issue. I'll take multiple versions of all these games. Just it's going to be more of that, and it seems like we can't really depend or even look forward to cool third-party stuff from the PS1 and PSP days. But moving on to our first news story, we have a new PS5 system software update. This one was 23.01, 07.61.00, and this one was a mandatory update, so you probably already installed this, and it's a very minor one, so just a slight improvement to your overall system performance. Now, the real news story here is our next one for a separate firmware update that went out to a very small selection of users in the beta program, because this was a separate email for PS Plus Premium beta testers, and it was very much for PlayStation 5 game streaming. So I had a feeling this was the firmware where they would finally start offering this. This one I do not have, otherwise we would be testing it and I'd show you some footage. But for the time being, we do have some kind folks over at Reset Era that were sharing their experience and some screenshots. So We do know that right now there's only a handful of titles that are available, which includes God of War Ragnarok, Horizon Forbidden West, Demon's Souls, Sackboy Big Adventure, Death Stranding, Fall Guys, Fortnite, Destiny 2. There's a few other titles on there, but we do have the screenshots, and big credit to them for putting these up because we can see that they look really good. There's minimal streaming artifacts, and that's partly because, like the current streaming experience with PS3 and PS4 titles, you can invoke an activity card that lets you adjust the resolution of the stream, but because these are PS5 titles, not only can you do 720, 1080, 1440, but you can also do full 2160p. And so based on the feedback so far, they're saying it looks really good and that the latency is also quite minimal as well. But we also have a separate news report from Insider Gaming, which provides some context on these new PS5 server blades that Sony is building out. So allegedly, this project is codenamed Kronos, and it began 5 years ago. Due to the complexity of PS5's at the time industry-leading SSD speeds, the company had to develop a new network storage solution that would bridge together PS5's custom I/O units. So the final result is a custom storage server codenamed Kura, which can handle 5 gigabytes per second with 1 millisecond of latency. Well, less than 1 millisecond of latency. Insider Gaming sources also say that Sony will have 28 data centers and that they're still expecting to fully launch this by this fiscal year, so that would run to at least March 2024, so it should be available widely before then at the very minimum. And this is, honestly, to me, pretty exciting because, I've been saying for years, and really I've been waiting for this, which is they are eventually going to deploy custom PlayStation 5 server blades, and that is going to be, you would hope, substantially better than what we have come to know, which are very outdated PS3 and PS4 for that matter, server blades that have amounted to a very not good experience, to put it lightly, right? Which we can chalk up to not only home network speeds, but also the providers themselves. So Sony's been not great in this area. Even something like Stadia, which the latency is good there, the image quality is good, but then there's no original content. You go over to GeForce Now and not everything is playable there. So there's always been a litany of problems in this space, but Sony does have a good opportunity as an established platform holder to, offer something that makes sense and it works reliably. So with PlayStation 5, it's just the time delta is huge here. There's so many advances that have been made in this space. So between whatever sort of proprietary solution Sony comes up with and just utilizing more modern codecs and things like that, this could be a lot more, way more usable than it's ever been. So I really cannot wait to try this out and test it because even though it would still take 5-10 years for streaming to really catch on, right, and I'm still like a physical media guy, obviously, but there's still utility to, in the here and now, using streaming, right, to say, try a game out before you commit to downloading 90 gigabytes of data, right? Like there's, just that use case alone makes a lot of sense, but this could also be a substantial value proposition to premium where, the streaming option's kind of a write-off, but when it starts including PS5 titles and the experience is good, all of a sudden premium makes way more sense without having to really focus and harp on the, the trials or the classic games. So there's a lot of big things that can happen here, and it seems like Sony is finally going to start rolling this out. So we will be watching this very closely, and I'll be testing it out as soon as I possibly can. Now, in much less exciting news, which, that's maybe not the best way to put it, this is kind of cool, but it's PlayStation Stars. So these are now showing up in the PS5's privacy settings. So nothing crazy here, but it does show that they're finally rolling PlayStation Stars out to, something directly on the console. Before when they launched this program, it was primarily on the smartphone app, and then they, did offer some kind of visibility on PlayStation.com, but they were hinting at possibly rolling this out to having some kind of experience on the console where you can manage your points and show off your display cabinet of your digital collectibles, and so perhaps they'll do that sometime soon. I wouldn't say this is going to happen in the next firmware because right now in the current beta program the profiles still look the same, but perhaps the firmware after that they'll redesign profiles and there'll be a way to be able to more directly interface with PlayStation Stars directly on PS5 rather than the mobile app. Moving on to our next breaking news story here, because I clearly had to film this after the fact, but this is hot off the presses. It seems like we finally have our expected leak for the PS5 detachable disk drive console, considering Sony is planning on shipping this thing sometime next month, and this happens every time where we get some kind of spy shot for the new slight model revision. Either it's a slim machine, or in this case, not really slim, but still it's different enough to where we're going to get some kind of leak before Sony talks about this thing officially. So this popped up on the Chinese gaming enthusiast forum, av9g.com, which we've seen things come out of there plenty of times. And shout out to Andrew Marmo at the Marmalade on Twitter for tipping everyone off about this and letting more people know. But I would not talk about this unless I felt pretty good about the legitimacy of it, because what also happened is that the one Twitter account at BWE_dev, they had described this console yesterday, and now they're also confirming that this is the console that they saw, right? So they described what this machine looked like, which principally still looks like the PlayStation 5 we know today, and the way it's being described is that in terms of the general size of the machine, it's still basically pretty big, just that it might be a little bit shorter, maybe a tad thinner, but this thing is still going to be, you know, quite large like the current console. But in terms of those slight design changes, we can see that the center portion of the system now has a bit of a curvature, and there's these two big slits in the console covers. This is the most surprising thing to me, I think, because I would have figured that they would maybe try and design this thing so that it could still use the existing console covers, since they're obviously selling those right now. They're even on sale, part of the PlayStation 5 sale to, you know, liquidate some of the current models, but also they're doing accessories and like the DualSense and console covers, but I digress. Yeah, so there's that, and this is all we have right now is this one picture that I'm showing you, so we still don't necessarily know what the mechanism is for the detachable disk drive, and, you know, how you pull it out, how you add it in, where that fits in with the console covers, but now seeing the slits, maybe we can theorize further, but for now, it seems like this is likely the console that we are getting. So again, I wouldn't really bring this up unless I felt pretty good about it, because this always happens with any sort of PlayStation hardware, and really a lot of hardware goes through the same thing, right? If it gets close enough to when they're planning on manufacturing and shipping, that's probably what's going on here. Although the picture we do have seems to be a promo image, so not a real life photo. But for now, that's what we have, and we'll get back to the rest of the LTPS episode. Moving on to our next news story, we have some Sony financials to go over, their fiscal year Q1 2023 financial report, and as always, let's dive into the PlayStation business, talk about some numbers, and also go over the two things that were a little bit interesting out of this report. So first off, Sony shipped 3.3 million PS5s, which is up from 2.4 year on year, for a worldwide total of 41.7 million. Now, Sony says that's actually somewhat less than they were expecting for their very ambitious 25 million fiscal year target, but the new sales promotions are seeing them get that momentum. As for the digital software ratio, that was 72%, and that's down a bit from last year, but that's also up from the last quarter, so that's not really moving around too much. Same with the monthly active users, it's 108 million, so that's the same from the last quarter, but still up from last year overall. Sony does mention software sales are up 27% year over year thanks to PS5 hardware adoption, good third-party software, and positive exchange rates. They do also say that reaching that 25 million target is a top priority, and they will implement necessary measures to reach that goal. Now, the two interesting things in this report is that, for one, they did not disclose PS Plus subscribers this quarter, and two, in their forecast for the fiscal year, which sees the OIBDA slightly adjusted 3% up, one negative impact in there is, quote, impact of changes in the launch dates of a portion of first-party titles, which is basically lingo for them saying that there's internal delays that push these games into the next fiscal year, which would run from April 2024 to March 2025, sometime around there. But they were planning on launching more games, presumably during this fiscal year, which, based on what we know, we can surmise that one of them at the very least was probably The Last of Us multiplayer. You know, we can look back at previous reports and their corporate strategy meetings and, you know, how they had this very aggressive rollout plan for live service titles, you know, by 2025 and 26, and we can see that these games are not out just yet. So at the very minimum, The Last of Us is probably one of them based on, you know, Naughty Dog's statement and the report we had about Bungie coming in and this and that, right? But, you know, that's one title. There's probably one or two other ones that got shuffled around, but you know, the adjustment wasn't that much to begin with, so a lot of the impact is really offset by what Sony says is, you know, growing third-party software and PS5 adoption, so that seems to be playing a role and not, you know, really making this a huge negative impact overall, but certainly something where we're tipped off on, you know, what is a very normal thing is internal delays for these games. But also the PS Plus subscribers. Now, I could have sworn, did I not say that during the last report where they did outline PS Plus Extra and Premium subscribers, which I thought was surprising. I'm like, oh, they're actually talking about this stuff, probably because they're proud of it, but also they might be, you know, outlining this stuff right before, excuse me, there's maybe an expected drop-off, right? Because it was, you know, right before they were going to hit that 1 year anniversary where probably a lot of people that decided to up their subscription to Extra or Premium, maybe they're not going to renew. And so it's very timely to put out the numbers. And then if it is something where they see a decline or it's not growing substantially, then they'll stop talking about it or bringing it up. And now they're just flat out not saying anything about PS Plus, which that kind of goes into how PS Plus subscribers it's been saturated. It sits around 45 million to 48 was their peak, and they haven't hit that since because there's only so many people you can really get to subscribe. That's why they did Extra and Premium, to bump up that average spend per subscriber. So I don't think they're going to talk about these numbers ever again unless it's something good, like them hitting 50 or Extra and Premium going back up. But it does seem like for now, they're not going to outline Plus subscribers. Now let's move on to some Square Enix financials, because this goes into the ongoing story about the sales for Final Fantasy XVI, if the game did well, if it did not do well. It's been really interesting watching this play out with, you know, is the game actually selling the way that Square is expecting it? And so recently they've, you know, released some new statements about the game's performance from the recent financial report. And this has been a bit misconstrued on what was actually said. So with Square's most recent financials, we saw that their revenue was up 14% year on year, but their profits were down a massive 65%. And that resulted in a steep drop in their share price. And during the earnings call, the company touched on, you know, Final Fantasy XVI sales, where they did reaffirm the game did meet expectations, with Square CEO also mentioning that the PS5 stock shortages led to a slower adoption of the hardware. So with the shortages over, they're hoping for a boost in software sales over time. But the penetration thus far has been quite good, and that's apparently what was actually said, as outlined from David Gibson, who was on the earnings call. And the greater context to the whole report is that largely Final Fantasy XVI is not offsetting some of Square's other misfires, where a big part of the drop-off also comes from mobile and MMO. And then there's also the mid-sized games like Star Ocean, Valkyrie, Harvestia. Those probably did not fare all that well either, which led Square to also say that they're going to refocus more on AAA stuff as well. But that is what they said, so it's not a matter of, you know, the headlines that went out, and there was another Bloomberg report about how the game didn't meet expectations or something, or not on it was on the lower end of expectations, which, you know, admittedly, that is certainly believable in a sense. I mean, when a company says it met expectations or it did well or this and that, you know, they can say that, but they can have a sort of case scenario of the game selling, you know, the game selling X, Y, and Z, and ideally any company wants the high end to be met or exceeded. So I'm sure Square would love to sell more than 3 million. Let's, you know, obviously put it that way. But having said that, this is still something where the game is more than likely a long-term play for Square, especially when it does eventually ship on PC, right? When you compare it to 15 or 7 Remake, it was either on more platforms or it was on a more established platform. So this game was not going to ever, you know, meet those other numbers. It is a long-term play for the game. And so for Square, it really is a matter of how is the game going to do week on week. If the performance is still bad there, then yeah, they probably have something to worry about. Moving on to our next news story, also related to financial reports, is Take-Two, where the CEO, Strauss Zelnick, was speaking with IGN, and one interesting thing that came up was about mid-cycle updates and how for something like PlayStation 5, he delivered a quote here that's been getting shared around for a bit and making some headlines, where he says, and I quote here, "Generally speaking, the mid-generation upgrades haven't really changed much," going on to say that the upgrades aren't all that meaningful, and that for them, it doesn't really change the way he thinks about how they're making or selling games from a publisher perspective. And that's basically it. He didn't really say much more beyond that. It's more him coming from a place of, as a publisher, we don't really need to do much in terms of changing the strategy of how we, as he says, makes and releases video games. The mid-cycle updates have always been very much more for the platform holder to, because they're very niche machines, right? I mean, the only figure we ever actually got between Xbox One X and PS4 Pro is when Jim Ryan said about 1 in 5 are PS5, or 1 in 5 is a PS4 Pro, excuse me. So very much they're speaking to a smaller audience, those that probably already have a PS4. So it's more about customer retention, getting them to buy new hardware and stay within the ecosystem and feel like they're getting the latest and greatest. And so that's probably still going to be the case for an inevitable PS5, assuming we do see this thing actually come out at some point. And so for publishers, it really doesn't change all that much. Now, in other Rockstar news, I would be remiss to not bring this up, but the recent announcement of a Red Dead Redemption port for PlayStation 4 and also Nintendo Switch has seen a lot of controversy because of the circumstances surrounding this port, which is it's very much a standard port. So there's no multiplayer, no bump to frame rate. It's more or less just the standard game on PS4, 30 frames per second, and also Undead Nightmares. And they're throwing on additional languages, but for the most part, it's a straight PS4 game, no native PS5 version, and they're also charging $50 for it. Now, there's also the reason why it's only on PS4 and Switch, which is that on Xbox, the game is part of the backwards compatibility program. So if you have the original disc, you insert it, you pull the digital copy of the game, which has a resolution bump, frame rate bump, looks gorgeous, plays great on Xbox Series X, and it also does not cost $50. So it's a very poor value proposition, which is not uncharacteristic of Rockstar in a situation like this based on the Grand Theft Auto Definitive Edition, but it's still something where this is bad. And I'm always of the mind where, and I've said this much before, it's like with price, I find that when it comes to video games, it's really hard to make a judgment call and incorporate that in like a review or making an assessment of something's value when games do not have the kind of expectations TV, music, and film do, where you kind of know what you're getting in terms of length at the very minimum, but games vary so widely on that spectrum alongside how they typically lose value over time, right? So, you don't have to spend $50 on day one for something. You can wait until it's, $5, $10, and, at that point, obviously the value is a lot different compared to when it came out on day one. But having said that, this is bad, and it's one of those disappointing things where, well, if you're a Nintendo owner, that version of the game certainly makes sense given the hardware, but for PlayStation 4 in particular, this is the short end of the stick when compared to a close competitor. So disappointing, but something where that's what Rockstar felt they could get away with right now, shipping the game on PlayStation 4. Moving on to our next news story, there's been some really cool, exciting developments going on in the PlayStation modding exploit scene. Don't really dive too much into this myself, but I love watching this stuff happen. And so recently, if you remember a long time ago, Lance McDonald had a 60 FPS patch for Bloodborne where he made a slight adjustment to the game's code, and sure enough, you can easily unlock the frame rate on that game, and it runs pretty damn well. And so recently, at Illusion0002 on formerly Twitter, it's going to be so hard for me to not call it Twitter, but They recently got that patch up and running on PlayStation 5 retail PS5 hardware. Now this is of course something where it's on an older firmware, 3.0 between 4.51, so it has to be a console that's completely offline, no PSN functionality, you can't log in and things like that. But if you keep the console on an old firmware where this exploit is possible, then you can deploy and install these new patches for not only Bloodborne running at a full 60 FPS on retail PS5s, but also recently there was a patch for the Order 1886 as well, and Digital Foundry did some coverage on that with a lot of footage, and it looks absolutely gorgeous. That game looks so good, and it looks amazing at 60 FPS. So this is what's going on in the scene lately, but it's something where it's not going to apply to a lot of people that can't do this because most PS5s are connected online and they eventually take on updates. But this is what has been going on lately, and it's really cool. And it seems like there's a lot more titles that Illusion is going to do for unlocking the frame rate on older titles where it's possible and the results turn out as well as they do. All right, let's move on to some PlayStation Productions news, starting with the Twisted Metal TV series, where so far it seems like it's doing really well based on what NBC Universal is saying. Now, they did not outline exact numbers here, but what they did say is that this series is their most binged comedy premiere to date, with most viewers on average watching 3 episodes per sitting, which would then place this in Peacock's top 5 for original series debuts. So I think it would be safe to say that this show is doing well, and moreover, I don't see how this does not get a season 2, outside of the very obvious SAG strike, which could be a problem down the road where maybe, certain characters don't return or this and that, right? But assuming that resolves at some point and people are back to work, I'm sure they are going to want a season 2 out of this thing, which seems to be quite good. Now, as for the Gran Turismo movie, we have some reviews finally coming out for this, and so far it's been pretty good, I'd say, at least judging from a review aggregate website like Rotten Tomatoes, where the current score is like 54-something%, but that's obviously an average, so there's plenty of folks that seem to really like it, and there are some that are a little bit more mixed, but even the mixed ones, it's like not bad. It's just a matter of, the movie has some low parts, but there's certainly still some highs that are worth, checking out, and the film is not totally bad or this, that, and the other, and, generally this is also something where the audience scores can be a lot higher than the review scores, so seems like another, I don't want to say like an easy W here, but I mean, if you would have asked me 2-something years ago, back when PlayStation Productions was really kicking off and we were talking about all these IP getting adopted for TV and film, I mean, I'm always optimistic. I think a lot of you know that, but there's still like a lot of skepticism with like, okay, are you guys really going to do this correctly? And it seems like so far the effort is certainly there. Not everything is like a knockout success, but it seems like they're certainly putting out things that are worth checking out if you're into the property. Now, I think it would be fair to say that the worst PS production so far is the Uncharted movie, which depends on who you're asking. I did not hate it. I thought it was a fun action film that obviously wasn't really, the kind of Uncharted we were hoping for. But having said that, one thing we can say is that we're probably getting a sequel based on what the producer Charles Roven recently said when speaking with The Hollywood Reporter, where they asked straight up if there is a desire to continue Uncharted after the good box office performance, and he said, and I quote here, "Oh yeah, we had a really good time with that movie. The fans really liked the movie, and people who didn't know anything about the game really liked the movie. So we are definitely looking to make another one of those." Now, obviously, the standout there is his proclamation that fans like the game when, well, those that did not like the movie are probably going to start, shouting from the rooftops. But I'm sure some did genuinely enjoy the movie that did also play the games. But having said that, I don't see how they were not going to do a sequel for this either. And at the very minimum, if they do plan on doing a sequel based on how the last one ended, that might finally get into the timeline of where Drake and Sully really are in the games. You would imagine, or at least it's still kind of more of an origin story, but at least Sully will maybe have his mustache. I know it's hard to sell the idea of that being Drake and Sully when Tom is so young looking and Mark Wahlberg is Mark Wahlberg, but I still find the chemistry was there in terms of their banter. It very much sounded like Drake and Sully, but it's hard to get sold on that when they are who they are. But that was probably going to get a sequel anyway. Now, I know many of you look forward to our yearly PlayStation 3 online updates where we explore a bunch of PS3 official servers and unofficial servers, which we have to lean more and more on because that's what this news story is about. EA recently updated their site, and now a number of games are going offline from the PlayStation 3 generation. So that would be things like Battlefield 1943, Bad Company 2, Crysis 3, Dante's Inferno, and also Dead Space 2, which a lot of this is going to see a staggered closure, but pretty much all these should be closed by December 2023. So we are losing more official servers from the PlayStation 3 cycle. Yet again, end of an era, but it's been an end of an era thing for many years now. It just depends on the game and the publisher. EA did have these going for a long time, but yeah, that's a number of titles that are going to be shut down. Maybe we'll check them out towards their final days and, play around for a bit with the community. Now, with all that said, it is time for Let's Talk Plus, the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway where one of you can win a $10 PSN code. I would like to congratulate this viewer right here. I'll be contacting you very soon via email or Twitter, and if you'd like to win a $10 PSN code, it's so simple. You can follow the link down below. Supporting this channel a number of ways can gain you an entry, and I'll announce the winner next week because I'm trying to help pay for your games. Those are all the news stories from this past week that I wanted to talk about through all, and our Tuesday video was looking at my PS5 total playtime, top 10 games based on hours played. We did PS4, now let's check out my PS5 playtime, and that is pretty much it. So that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki, thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.